Hello. Our second panel this afternoon is entitled Watergate and the Media, Did the System Work? To help lead our distinguished speakers through an exploration of this question is our moderator, David Oshinsky. Oshinsky holds the Jack Blanton Chair in History at the University of Texas at Austin. He specializes in 20th century American political history and is the author of several books, including A Conspiracy So Immense, The World of Joe McCarthy, Worse Than Slavery, Parchman Farm and the Ordeal of Jim Crow Justice, and most recently, Polio, An American Story, which won the Pulitzer Prize in History. I'm pleased to welcome my friend David Oshinsky.
I don't think the gentlemen on my left need a reintroduction. So let me start with the gentleman to my far right, Roderick Hart. Rod is the Dean of the College of Communications at UT and holds the Shivers Chair in Communications and Government. He's the author of numerous books, including Campaign Talk, Why Elections Are Good for Us, and most recently, Political Keywords Using Language That Uses Us. His many honors include being named a Distinguished Scholar by the National Communications Association and being elected to the Academy of Distinguished Teachers here at UT. Rich Oppel, to my right, has been editor of the Austin American Statesman since 1995. Rich is responsible for news and editorial content of that paper. Among Rich's career stops were the Associated Press and the editorships of the Tallahassee Democrat and the Charlotte Observer. During the Clinton years, Rich was bureau chief for Knight Ridder. Rich is a member of the Pulitzer Board. He and his wife Carol have 2 children in journalism. Daughter Shelby is a reporter at the Portland Oregonian, and his son Rich Jr., as many of you know, is the insightful and courageous Baghdad correspondent for the New York Times. Welcome to both of you. Our panel today is titled Watergate, Did the System Really Work? And I just want to take 30 seconds to describe it. For many historians and journalists, Watergate is one of our great success stories, a time when our legislative and judicial branches, in concert with dogged pursuit from the Fourth Estate, the press, worked to uncover and punish massive, indeed constitution-threatening crimes within the executive branch. But there's also another way to look at Watergate. It was not so much the system as a handful of individuals, some now forgotten, who prodded that system into action and kept it moving in the face of enormous resistance and inertia. And there was also some luck. So I'll mention 3 people and then we'll get to the discussion at hand. There was Frank Wills, whom both of you know, and he was the $80 a week night watchman at Watergate who found tape on the doors. Without Frank Wills, who knows? There was a determination of John Sirica, the stern federal judge who refused to accept that Watergate was simply a break-in, unrelated to larger events. And most of all, I think, there was the persistence of Woodward and Bernstein, who helped break Watergate wide open. Without these few people, the Watergate crisis may well have gone undetected, and Richard Nixon might easily have served out a full second term. So my first question, Carl, is to you. In reading recently a very perceptive essay at the end of The Secret Man, you talk about the vending machine moment. And I was wondering if you could share that with the rest of us.
Sure. Bob and I, each day we would go to work, we would get together about 8 or 9 in the morning in a little vending machine off the newsroom floor to sort of put together what we were going to present to the editors that day. Kind of good cop, bad cop routine, and I'll let you decide who you thought was the good cop and the bad cop. Always helps to have somebody like that. It's great. So
I allow you to be yourself.
So we had just learned that there was a secret fund maintained by the highest officials in the Nixon administration, particularly the former Attorney General John Mitchell, that paid for the bugging and other undercover activities. We hadn't put it in the paper yet. And I went over and I pushed the button for this horrible coffee that came out of this machine. And I felt literally a chill go down my back, literally. And I said, I turned to Woodward and said, oh my God. I said, this president is going to be impeached. And Woodward looked at me and he said, oh my God, you're right. And we can never use that word impeachment in this newsroom because somebody might think we have an agenda. And at the time, it was so far before the word or the thought had occurred to anybody, but there was something that it was possible to sense if you knew what we knew. And if
It was the anticipation of the bad coffee.
So, we never did use the word in the newsroom.
For about a year.
That's right. It was a good year before it became a topic. But sometimes you get a moment like where you think you do know perhaps where the story is going, and we can truthfully say it never affected anything that we did, except a sense of
You
maybe
kept
some
that
awe.
story out of All the President's Men, did you not?
We did, and I regret that we did, actually, because we said when we wrote All the President's Men that we were going to lay everything out there, and I don't know if did we discuss? I don't think we did discuss putting it in.
I don't think so. I mean, there are a number of stories we forgot. Can I tell one?
Sure.
That's not in All the President's
I
I have to listen to this again.
Yeah, but this is classic. We're in the midst of working on the story, and we're writing the stories, and the White House is denouncing us, and we're spending a lot of late nights in the newsroom at the Post. And Carl came over, and there's a little type piece of paper
In my typewriter.
that had been put in your typewriter, and it said, "Bernstein, watch yourself. You went too far last night." And we looked at this and said, "Wow, this means Haldeman or Ehrlichman or somebody at the White House knows what we're doing."
And they've got a mole.
And they've got a mole, or there's a plant in the Washington Post, or somebody. And we felt kind of good, maybe we're on to something because we're important enough to be threatened. So we looked all around and we started, who could have got in, who put this in, and so forth. And we scurried around for a while, kind of not getting anywhere. And another reporter finally cracked the case that the very threatening "Bernstein, watch yourself, you went too far last night" had not been written by or sent by Haldeman or Ehrlichman, but a copy girl that Carl was dating.
True story.
True story. Do you remember her name?
Sure. Liz.
She's coming out with a book next week called "The Bernstein I Knew." Briefly.
Let me ask one follow-up, and then we'll turn to some of the other panelists. Would you share with the audience some of your thoughts about Deep Throat, his motives, his goals, and obviously, you write, certainly in The Secret Man, about an FBI that seemed to have all of this information at its own fingertips and wasn't really handling it. And how does Mark Felt fit into that?
Well, he was the highest level source, I guess, we had, and he would not give us a lot of specifics, but he gave us a lot of confidence and confirmed things. And the confidence factor was critical because you're on the right track. This is a big deal. This is bigger than you think it is. It fed right into the notion Carl had very early that this is not just a little thing, and as soon as with our reporting and what Mark Felt said, we could see that this was a giant effort, that this was organized, well-funded, Mark Felt told us that there were 50 people who Donald Segretti, who was kind of the lead Nixon campaign saboteur and spy master, had working for him or other people. And if you were to go look at the Senate Watergate investigation, they found, I think, about 63. They had a guy named Jack Caulfield who climbed a telephone pole and put a tap on Joe Kraft's telephone. He was a prominent Washington columnist. They had a guy who was the chauffeur for Muskie, who was running for president, and he would steal. His job was to transfer documents from Muskie's Senate headquarters to his campaign headquarters, and he was paid to spy and Xerox documents that were in this transfer, and there were so many documents that he actually had to rent an apartment in a Xerox machine. So he would stop at the apartment and Xerox everything and then give it to the Nixon campaign and then go on and let Muskie see it.
But what was, in other words, what motivated Felt, do you think?
Well, as we attempted to unravel in that book, and it's not a complete unraveling, he was outraged at what was going on. He was also very upset that he was not made FBI director. He was a Hoover acolyte. He was protecting the Bureau, I think. He felt that the FBI was under assault here. And he was not the sort of source who was calling us. I mean, you used to have to beat on my head to go see him, and I would be reluctant.
You were resistant.
Because he was
didn't want to use
resistant.
him too much.
Yeah, yeah. And it was clearly very delicate, but he was an engine who was moving us along as our editors were moving us along.
Carl, the idea that Watergate profoundly changed American journalism is a pretty accepted idea today. But I'd like to know how you think it has changed American journalism in lasting ways that still prevail today.
I think the first thing has to do with mythology, and that we became the subject of too much mythology, actually. And as a result, even though we had set out in All the President's Men to sort of show how grubby and basic the process of reporting is, that nonetheless the prominence of it gave it subsequently a mythic quality, as well as the fact that it became a movie. And for the best of reasons, for a while, journalism became this thing that people wanted to be attached to.
But it's still grubby today, is what you're saying.
When it's good, it's grubby. Because it is, what you see in that movie of All the President's Men is not, sophisticated guys with a lot of high-level sources. You see some people knocking on doors and eating McDonald's hamburgers and going through what is the real way, even today, that you do the reporting.
What about the relationship with government? Has that changed?
We had the advantage of being outsiders. And in this story particularly, because we didn't have the high-level sources, we were able to plug in at first through a list of employees of Nixon's re-election committee to the drivers and secretaries and bookkeepers of the campaign. But I think that thereafter, a myth developed that this was the high point of American journalism, and that there has been some kind of decline since. And I don't subscribe to that. I think that there has always been great reporting in the media. I think today there is more great reporting in the major newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and one or two others than there was at the time of Watergate. But great reporting has always been exceptional. And one of the effects was, I think, a kind of careerism that entered into the profession more than perhaps it should have, or not perhaps, in which too many people wanted to make a big splash fast. And I think Bob once used the example of somebody gets hired right away to go on the staff, and the county editor sends them to the county fair to go down there and look at the cows, and instead the reporter goes right to the treasurer and says, let me see the books. I think there's an awful lot of that so-called gotcha attitude that has taking shortcuts and looking for simple stories, when in fact what that process, that messy process is about, is just seeing where incrementally the steps taken.
So has that careerism caused an estrangement between the press and the readers, do you think?
I think that I think there's going to, right now you see that the press is right up there with used car salesmen in all the polls. I suspect to some extent that is going to change as people realize that in this war, which Bob has been out there around the country and said to me this morning this thing about how people in this country are outraged about this war. Well, why? Not because of what the administration told them, because they know it from the press. And even though the press was slow getting off the mark, there's been great reporting. Just, the last thing, the Washington Post series on Walter Reed. Yeah. There's been great, everything we know about the lies and the mendacity of this president, vice president, secretary of state, et cetera. We know from the press. We sure as hell don't know it from them, and we don't know it from the Congress and its oversight.
To follow up with Bob on the same thread, the use of sources, Bob. You had to use confidential sources on Watergate, and I think we can understand today why it was necessary to do that. But didn't the Watergate coverage cause a proliferation of confidential sources that have wound up eroding a lot of the credibility that people have in the press?
Well, some of that has happened, but you still, particularly if you're writing about national security or the Iraq War or what the CIA is doing, you are naive if you think people are going to go on the record because they're going to lose their jobs or go to jail.
Even in the state legislature.
Yeah, that's right. So I take a pretty aggressive posture on this, I'll be frank with you. I think we need more unnamed sources, because often the named sources are the mayor or somebody saying something that's not true. And
but at least we've got them on a record line, as opposed to
but you don't get them lying on the record until you get the confidential source who tells you they're lying.
Exactly. And when you use confidential sources, you're putting your own reputation, the reputation of your newspaper on the line. And at the Post, there's a pretty rigorous process to check who those sources are and make sure that the people who are being written about have been given a full opportunity to give their side of events and so forth.
But why is it so widespread in Washington and not so much the case in state capitals and other places where power is concentrated? Is it because we in the regional newspapers are slackers and are not as aggressive in pursuing stories? Or is it because Washington reporters have caved in and just accepted it?
I don't know whether it's, is it used in your newspaper?
Do you have a policy, Rich?
Sure, we have a policy, and we will allow confidential sources, but I have to know who they are, and I've got to know something about why they have to be confidential, and normally there's got to be corroboration with other documents or sources, at least
but
partially.
Sometimes isn't that information the best information you put in your newspaper?
It can be, but
Yeah,
I think it's put in the newspapers at cost to the credibility of the newspapers. And when I look at the arc of coverage in our paper, most of the confidential sources we use emanate from Washington agencies, national newspapers, incorporating them in their stories, which are syndicated.
But so much of that is in the area where you're dealing with classified information. In the state capitals, they don't have secret and top secret and confidential.
Well, I can tell you, I was the chief Virginia reporter at the time of, it's covering the state capitol at the time of Watergate. And most of my stories that really told you what was going on in the governor's office and in the legislature were coming from confidential
Yeah.
sources.
See, I think we don't use it enough, and I really think editors should push people not to use confidential sources, but to get to the bottom of things. And if you're really going to get to the bottom of something, you probably are going to need some confidential sources, unless you've got a whistleblower or somebody who's coming forth with documents.
Not to belabor the point too much, but
Yeah.
I think that if you really get to the bottom of something, you don't have to use the confidential source. You might know it confidentially from a source, but using that, getting to the documents, to other sources, to corroboration, will allow you to publish that story without having to say, I think, to the dismay of readers often, I know this person, but you don't.
Okay, well, I really disagree with
I
you.
do too.
And I think I'll give you an example. In the summer of 2002, I published a story. It was, I think, on the anniversary of Watergate, frankly, June 17th. It was the lead story in the Washington Post saying, President Bush had signed a top-secret finding, an intelligence order to the CIA to topple Saddam Hussein. And I had maybe 5 sources for that story. None of them were named. And if you think any of them were ever going to go on the record, you're wrong. Because if they went on the record, they'd be in jail.
I was going to
or
say they'd be
fired.
prosecuted.
Now, if you look back at that story, it was Al Hunt at the Wall Street Journal, the only person who picked up on it, who said, now because of this story, it looks like we're going to have a war with Saddam Hussein, which we did 9 months later. So there are many circumstances where something is really central to what's going on. And that story, particularly in retrospect, I want to be honest, I didn't understand its significance, told you something that you were never going to get on the record.
Okay. Right.
Between 1972 and the present, depending upon how it's measured, respect and trust in government has declined by 30 to 40%. Which of you guys is responsible for that?
55-45.
But it's a concomitant of aggressive journalism, one would assume.
What if you were to say that trust in government, or whatever phrase you used, is the result not of the press, but of the quality of our so-called public servants and the work they do? The product and the lack of truth-telling. But back to this question, yours and the confidential sources, where they come together, it seems to me, is the unwillingness of people in public life today to speak candidly about what is true. And it is increasingly true in all of our institutions, partly, and it's a cultural thing, it's not just about politics. People lose their jobs. You're the head of a movie studio, and you try to explain yourself why your last movie was a flop, and you're the hell out of there. And indeed, there are confidential sources all the time in Variety explaining what. And I remember thinking to myself, almost sometimes I think that the only people willing in public life to speak regularly, truthfully, are baseball managers. But you'll see Joe Torre, he'll get up there and say, we really deserved to get our ass kicked last night. My guys couldn't hit, they couldn't field. When would you see the president say that? When would you see? But in sports, and even sports, you're seeing it less and less now as it becomes a bigger and bigger business.
A cognate question is between 1972 and the present, depending upon how you measure it. The respect for journalism has declined by about 30 to 40%. Which of you is responsible for that?
I think we all are.
Yeah.
And I think there are a couple of reasons. One, that we were talking about this earlier, the impatience and speed fed by the internet, and that, just give it to us quick. But a lot of it has to do with television. And there is something about television that somebody goes on television, And they may have very good information, or they may have a very useful opinion. Even the anchors for the major networks, and there is a kind of self-satisfaction and a kind of a smugness that even the best deliver with a little bit of a spin, and people can see it. Somebody's got an attitude. And after Nixon resigned, Katharine Graham, who was the publisher and owner of the Post, and the one who ultimately bore the responsibility for what we wrote in the newspaper, wrote us a long handwritten letter about recapping what had happened and so forth. And she gave us some advice and said, keep digging on things. And then she said something really important. And that was, beware the demon pomposity. And boy, amen. And pomposity, even when it's not intended to be pompous, even when somebody isn't pompous, particularly on television, you can seem very above it. People don't like that. And so we got to come down to earth more, and we have to present the product without that little, the English language is like a golf ball, or at least mine, it always has spin on it, one way or another. And you can see that, and people detect it and are really uncomfortable with it.
You're both celebrity journalists. Is that a good thing?
I don't know what the hell that means.
But
I mean, obviously, you know, we get attention, but
is it good for journalism, I guess is the question.
What is what?
is the fact that
The celebrity making of a journalist?
we live in a celebrity culture, and journalism is now part of. You know, you can't separate what we do from the rest of the culture, and I think that's part of what your questions are about. They represent an attempt to say we're different. You know, we're not much different than doctors. You go to the doctor, and you know, 10% of them save your life, maybe 5. Another 15% of them make you better than when you started. Another 25%, you know, pretty much the same as when you went in the joint. Another 20 or whatever percent, you're a little worse off, and the rest of them will kill you.
And most doctors are confidential sources.
That's right.
At least you hope.
But I've never had one who tells me I'm entering a no-spin zone.
That's right. But we are not much different in terms of the efficacy of what we do. That's how good we are at what we do. We're about like doctors, if you're going to try to generalize. You know, we're not all great. Not all newspapers are great. But one of the things that is different, it seems to me, since Watergate, the most important thing I believe that a reporter or an editor does is make the decision of what is news. What do you put on the front page? What do you cover? What is it that interests you? That agenda has changed wholly since the time of Watergate, some for the better as we've gone more towards style news and special sections, and an awful lot for the worst as we've gone more toward the sensational. And one reason I think that we're held in such low regard, and this gets back to television, talk radio, and reporters with notebooks for newspapers who just go in, and their purpose seems to be to manufacture controversy rather than to illuminate.
Let me ask one question about sources. I know you still use a lot of confidential sources in your books. Has the Scooter Libby case put a chill on this? In other words, is there you, in the case of Deep Throat, could promise him a lifetime of confidentiality.
33 years.
Yes.
Right? That's longer than most marriages.
Not yours.
Right, yes.
Certainly are. But we're doing good now.
What do you
Thank
think
God.
about that, Bob?
Yeah.
In other words, is there now a post-Scooter Libby world? In terms of
There was a lot of focus on the Scooter Libby trial because of the secrecy and the mystery of the Bush administration. I testified to the special prosecutor because my source not only said there's no confidentiality agreement anymore, he asked me to testify, and I testified in the trial. So I was a voluntary witness, so no one has seen me dragged before a grand jury. If my source had not released me, then I would have resisted, and I will resist, and I think people in the press will. I just hope people in government think about the public policy implications of calling people before grand juries. I think it is just bad, stupid public policy. I think, what is it, Senator Barack Obama says he's not opposed to all wars, but only dumb wars. I would not be opposed. I could see circumstances where you want to call a reporter before a grand jury. But this case, I mean, the prosecutor spent years on it, never even prosecuted anyone for it, and knew who the source was, Richard Armitage, who was my source. I mean, when you get into the details of it, it's kind of a case that probably shouldn't have been there. It's had no impact that I can measure.
But can you give the same assurance to a source
Damn right.
today? You can.
Damn
Sure,
right.
of
Damn
course
right.
you can. Because
Look
the principle remains the same. If push comes to shove, like Bob just said, if Armitage had said no, he'd be in a slammer.
Yeah, that's right. Instead of being here.
Right. But I would visit.
You would visit. That's right. Isn't that loyal? You and that copy aide. No, I really don't think, I think, look, in the last book I did, State of Denial, came out about 4 or 5 months ago. It has more classified information in it. I reprint charts and language from classified reports showing the extent of the violence in Iraq, which they were denying, and no one has come after me because, you know what? I think they realize they're going to really look stupid if they're going to go after a reporter for putting the truth in a book. Truth is a wonderful defense, not just legally, but morally.
Bob, since the beginning of the Iraq War, more recently perhaps than at the beginning of it, we who are editors have heard a lot from our readers about if you had only been as aggressive as Woodward and Bernstein during Watergate, you could have stopped this war. I would argue that certainly we had our failings in terms of coverage and commentary, but I also think that there are some fundamental changes between Watergate and Iraq. The first Watergate story was in June 1972. Several months later, the president was reelected, and I've had at least one reader say Watergate failed because it allowed the reelection of Nixon. You probably heard the same thing. But the span of the Watergate coverage was, I think, 2 years and 2 months between that story and the resignation of the president. The span of the pre-invasion coverage was essentially about 5 months, from October 2002 to March of 2003.
No, I mean, I wrote that story about authorized covert action in Iraq in June of 2002, so that's 9 months before the war. People were reporting right after 9/11 that Iraq was next on the menu.
Right, and even the neocon agenda was widely disseminated and written about. I think your question reflects a really interesting dynamic, and that is the Congress of the United States approved that legislation by an overwhelming majority.
And it was a resolution.
A resolution by an overwhelming majority.
3 to 1.
And meanwhile, the press has and
But not enough. I'm this just for the war, three good sources who, in terms of Iraq, telling and sources believe in this period, smoking gun, intelligence, weapons instruction
And when
in
was-
Iraq. It was March or late February when most smoking gun, ironclad evidence that means Carter had been much more aggressive. All got caught in the
You had in Watergate, however, Congress said was
Yes.
willing to provide X. And those two things did exist in the period just before
what's
the
more
Iraq
comparable,
War.
though, is not Watergate and this war, but Vietnam, which was going on at the time, and this the coverage of Vietnam, where we ran into problems early on until then there came to be a lot of great reporting, as there has been a lot of great reporting through, virtually everything we know that's truthful about this war, we know through reporters.
So could the
But
press...
it was slow. But the one thing that was non-existent almost at the beginning, and I was in Baghdad just before the first war, and the claim of this president that that Saddam Hussein had something to do with international terrorism and with the attacks on 9/11, that willingness to report on the accuracy of that particular claim, put it in WMD for a minute, that was a story that was sitting for anybody who had been to Iraq, had sources to do. It was well known that Saddam Hussein, he wouldn't let terrorists in his country because the terrorists would take him out. He'd be the first one. He was a secular leader. He was a Stalinist. So that you have the reporting, the basic reporting on who this person was.
So at the bottom, could the press have stopped the war?
No, probably not.
No.
There was a momentum to that war. But here's another factor in comparing them. Watergate, there was clear crime, the breaking at the Democrats' office in the Watergate office building. And so it automatically went into the legal system. We were talking earlier in the panel that, well, this is a war. This is not, I mean, a lot of people think it's a crime, but it's a war. And the president has that authority under our Constitution. So it doesn't automatically get into the legal system. That makes a big, giant difference. There's no judge who's overseeing where and when and if somebody's going to go to jail, like Judge Sirica did in that
Also,
case.
our job is not to start a war or stop a war or keep a war from happening. It seems to me any more than our job is to declare something an illegal act or a legal act. That's, our job is to be judicious, but not judicial.
Can we turn the questioning on you? What do you think the biggest mistake you've made in war coverage in your newspaper?
We ran between about October 1st and March 1st, probably 35 to 40 stories on page one about Iraq. 19 of those had a critical content to them in one form or another Ted Kennedy's warnings, Hans Blix's report, I think, probably dominated
Right.
much of this.
He was the chief UN weapons
Yeah.
inspector in Iraq.
Making real progress.
And
at the
I
time
think
it was pulled
overall
out.
our coverage was fairly balanced. I think where we probably split, at least I would say so personally, was not being more critical editorially, allowing or inviting more commentary that was against the war. We could have done that. And being a little too supportive of the war in the beginning, toward the end, around the Powell speech to the UN, there was a line in an editorial I had that said basically the president has not proven the case.
No smoking gun.
Right.
Yeah.
Were I to go back again, I think I would take that line and expand it to more thorough commentary and reporting to the extent that
You're
we did.
not responsible for the editorial policy.
Yes.
Yes, he is. Yeah,
I
he
am.
does both.
You do
I
both?
report, yes, I report to a publisher who is ultimately responsible.
But no-
It's a,
You also
organized.
run the newsroom?
yes.
Yeah.
Texas, we say one riot, one ranger.
Don't you think that's a problem?
No. Somebody Carl, somebody ultimately is over both sides of the content, whether it's an editor or a publisher. Any Charlotte Observer and most newspapers, when I was with them, the editor was in charge of both the newsroom and editorial.
See,
I know that didn't exist with the
I
Post.
would say that just in terms of perception, I mean, I'm astounded to hear. Did you know this?
Yes, I
I
did.
did. You work in daily journalism.
We call it the Texas solution.
That's right.
And North Carolina and about
I think that, you know,
60% of the
one
newspapers in this
one
country.
of the things that has made America different traditionally than European journalism, and one of the great strengths has been this wall of separation between the newsroom and the editorial operation. And one of the things that has been...
He's the wall.
Yeah, that's great.
is a wall. There's a
Yeah.
managing editor who runs the newsroom and an editorial page editor who runs the editorial page. Ultimately, you have to have somebody above them. And at the paper you work for, the publisher was.
Exactly.
So what's the difference between the publisher and the editor?
Well, I think there is a difference, but that's a different discussion.
What is it?
Let me broaden the question a bit. In an era, a question is asked is, what's a journalist? Who's a journalist? Who isn't a journalist? Many with a digital era, internet information, there is user-generated content. Is that a good thing for journalism? Is it keeping people more honest? To have folks also giving you tips or reporting for?
Most of it is about it at all. I think it's insignificant over the side. I think that you find the real stories that are done in journalists and the Reed story. There's something about of and can get paid around with more authority, and I think evidence of it. But I kind of blogs in people just I want to know, but it's practice of the First Amendment.
Online from, and we look at the fact physical newspaper. Yeah. Of standards. And that readers know what those standards are, have some idea of what they are, would great system that is developed or different situation than years ago. So I think that we're all the beneficiaries of being forced to pay attention to other points of view, and that those people with a not a so-called objective, and I don't believe in the objective tradition exactly, but that nonetheless, they can get it right sometimes. And if they do, then we need to go with it.
But Carl, as you yourself have written, in so many of these places, there is no filter. There is no editor. There is no
That's true.
newsroom. These people are just putting stuff out on the web.
But most people know that.
Well, I'm not so sure you're right. I mean, I teach hundreds of students here, and you'd be surprised how many people get their information from the internet, and basically it's printed. Because it's printed, it has a kind of credibility, and my sense
But
is...
by the time they're done taking your course,
Oh,
you've set them
absolutely.
straight.
That's
I
right.
hope.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But you know, I mean, it's it's harder and harder now, certainly, to get students to pick up the New York Times and to read it.
Oh, forget it.
They're getting, not to mention the Washington Post. They're getting their information from other
No
sources, and those sources do not have filters. And the kids, many of them, it's there. It's got a credibility of its own.
One of the questions I'm interested in all of this is, how do we do better? How do we reach a point of introspection in our business so we make the product better? Now, put on your assignment editor hats for a moment, all three of you. And Carl and I, he's done with his book on Hillary Clinton. I'm done with my book, Bush at War, Part 4. I hope there's no Part 5 or 6. And we've decided to team up together. A couple
Start
of
your
old guys
newspaper.
were in wheelchairs at this point. Walkers were not in the wheel. And you're our assignment editors, and it's right at the time now. What do you want us to work on? And how do you want us to go about it? Are we going to be told no confidential sources? Are we going to be
Start a blog?
Start a blog? Start a newspaper? Go to the nursing home?
I think reporters could listen longer and harder. And I guess that's what I come back to with celebrity journalism. I think it's always good to be there first with the best and the best story. But it seems to me that one of the things that I'd want my students to do is to wait until they're really sure they've got it. And I think that's the greatest danger.
This is your point about
getting there too quickly.
reporters have become awful listeners. And it's part of the impatience.
And it's part of the that comes back to celebrity. It's part of the performing of journalism as a performance, rather than as an interactive, iterative process where you're constantly questioning yourself as well.
What do you want us to work on? What's our assignment? We're here, we're prowling around, and we're saying, come on, boss, where do we go?
I mean, a particular type of
Staley's
story.
budget for the ransom center.
I'll try to take
Staley.
that. I'll try to take
You're
that
a real editor is going to send us.
Number one, I would say, make this about public service journalism. That is the core. That's why we live and breathe. That's the important central issue that we've got to carry forward through all sorts of technological and cultural change. Number two.
Tell me what public service journalism, what you understand public service journalism to mean.
Well, it's what you guys did. Let's start with that. You were a check on government.
Something
You were
that
a
matters.
watchdog.
Something that matters. In other words, you would not send us out to do celebrity profiles for the style section.
I think maybe not you two guys,
Yeah.
and certainly not Carl. But there is room for that. But I think the centrality of journalism should be the public service aspect of it.
Yep.
I'd say keep your minds on that. Number two, recognize what the reader wants as well as what we think that the reader needs. We can get pretty pompous and self-important about defining news to the exclusion of a lot of other things that people are really interested in. Give the reader what he or she wants as well. If that happens to be celebrity journalism or light stuff, that's fine. Sports, I love sports. It's hardly of critical value. Well, maybe American democracy does depend on sports. I'm not sure.
Maybe we could do, I know what, one of the things people want is a column about marriage tips, and Carl and I could do a column. We've had 6 marriages.
That's right,
between
and
the
the third works.
You guys, would you guys write that for us?
Yeah,
We'll turn it into Statesman.
But I don't,
Right.
I don't
Let
think
me just add two
certainly.
things.
You're the boss.
Don't make this about print, newspaper print alone. It's not about the paper, it's about the journalism. And we can do online and through other media what you guys have done so successfully in print. And finally, understand that one of the things that we do bring to the table is verifiable, authoritative journalism. And there's a lot of blogs out there now and other things where people are doing journalism that's derivative of what you do. But what we bring to it that is, I think, essential and crucial is the verifiability. Those 4 things.
Let me address what you've said there as follows. First of all, that it seems to me that today's great American newspaper, whether you take the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, they're better than newspapers have ever been. One of the reasons they're better is because of their sports coverage, because of their coverage of the entertainment business, because of their coverage of style, because they reflect what people are interested in. That's why they're so great. And they're so much better than at the time of Watergate.
Well, if they're so great, why is circulation going down?
Well, partly because of magazines, partly because of the web. There are many reasons. But, you know, Maureen Dowd has said, you know, the best dollar you can spend in the world is
A dollar for the Times.
is dollar for the Times and the Post. But so I think that these
Well,
are...
she's objective.
Right. I said
Or you did say,
but so you have these great newspapers, but where I think what interests me is what Bob and I for years have called the bottom line being the best obtainable version of the truth. Whether that is, and you can have that in celebrity culture. You can have that in sports. You can have that at City Hall, and you can have that in what you call public service journalism. When that ceases to be the most important value of every one of those sections, that's where the troubles begin. And when page 6, for instance, or another gossip column or whatever it is, the best obtainable truth has very little to do with that.
You better tell them what page 6 is.
I bet you everybody, how many people here know what page 6 is?
See, 2/3 don't.
Okay, page 6.
It's the gossip
column of the New York Post, and it's the
Now
best.
you know.
The best read page in New York.
I think the assign.
It
I
is.
think, Bob, I would ask you to go and do a story about something you were not expert about, so it could not have anything to do with national politics, because I think that kind of rejuvenative thing is sometimes
He
a
wrote
real problem.
Wired. He wrote a biography of John Belushi.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that would be a way of constantly being connected to basic journalistic values and resisting, not that you do, but resisting another move in the same celebrity cycle.
What's your assignment?
I can't tell you what would make money, and you guys would probably go out of business quickly. And if you think the New York Times has a good sports section, you're already on the way down.
I agree. I totally agree with you. I agree with you.
Go with page 6 and go with the New York
No,
Post.
you're right about the Times sports
What I
section.
would say is, to me, and I realize readership is going down, but what makes a great newspaper, and the reason I make my kids read the New York Times, is that the Times has an extraordinary international perspective. Reading that newspaper, kids can find out about vaccinations in India, famines in Africa, all kinds of problems and issues in the developing world, all kinds of issues regarding a kind of foreign policy that goes beyond Iraq, which they never get in basically the sources they read. And to me, what differentiates both the Post and also the Wall Street Journal and the Times is we live in it's a globalization, and these are the 3 newspapers that are on top of it.
Now, what I would say to all of you, or individually, is what I'm worried about for the country. Obviously, the war, and there are all kinds of things going on. Environmental catastrophe could be coming. Healthcare state of the economy and so forth. But the thing that we really ought to worry about is secret government. Don't take something easy. Take something really hard. I've done books on the CIA or the Supreme Court, and it always starts out with somebody saying, you'll never find out what's going on. It's too secretive. It's too hidden. People take oaths, and you can do it. And that's the basic thing that you work against, secret government. It's the nightmare.
Good advice. Did Carl say what he would be, what his assignment, did you say what your assignment would be to us, to the press?
I go back to the best obtainable version of truth. Obviously, I agree about secrets. I mean, whether my last book was about the Pope and about the Vatican, which is the most secret of all institutions. But back to the notion of we have to be in the business of showing what is real and subjecting things to the test of truth. And back to something you said when you were talking about the errors that you thought your paper had made in its coverage. One of the things that bothers me is that we have not found in journalism a way to keep people focused on the untruths that are there and we have demonstrably shown are there. Yeah. That the people doing the basic telling of untruths control the agenda or try to the extent that they're very successful in moving on to the next thing and leaving what we have reported truthfully in the dust. This administration is a great example of it. The Nixon administration also was for a very long time. I think that if I were an editor, I would be running something on page 1 about every day reminding people of what they said. And it would be a regular feature, perhaps, and it would be hard news, but it would say, Bush has said 34 times, mission accomplished, this, that, the other thing, down the line. And not just about the administration, but about coverage generally, to keep focused, television as well.
But isn't that the ultimate frustration of an editor, that you report something and it doesn't have the impact or the consequence that you think it should, and you say, gee, I thought we did a good job on that, thought that was important.
Sometimes. I think initially...
But why not do something like that? Why not, on especially a great issue,
because it crosses that barrier you were talking about that you approved of between reporting the news and editorializing.
I don't think it does. No, to the contrary. We're under no obligation to just put something in the paper once.
Let me ask you something.
Watergate being the best example.
We recycled a lot of stories.
We sure as hell did. That's right.
But we always had
in the third paragraph.
Something new at the top.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
but
right.
By the way, yesterday...
Sometimes you have to do that.
Implicit in some of the things that you've said is that the 4 big newspapers, the Post, the Times, the Journal, the LA Times, maintain strength and do a good job.
Now.
Implicit is that maybe you think that the regional newspapers like ours in Houston and Dallas and Louisville or Charlotte or Des Moines and so on, that they're not quite doing the job today that they once did. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yes and no. It depends on the individual papers. I think if you're talking about what's going on in our communities, you have to start, first of all, talk about local television news. It is a disgrace in every market in America. And it is formulaic. If it bleeds, how many people believe that the local television news has anything to do with the reality of this community? I've asked this question 100 times. I've never had anybody raise their hand. One, maybe we've had 10 people by now. Yeah. So you start from that, because the truth is very much of what people in this community know about this community, they get from their local news, not just from your terrific newspaper. Second of all, that all over
now
America...
Now it's terrific, you notice. It didn't make the list.
No.
It's terrific.
It's a different function. It's a totally different function. And in fact, local newspapers like yours have the opportunity now to be great newspapers like they never were, because you get the New York Times news service. You don't have to put the money into international coverage national coverage. A lot of it is there, the best of it that you can cherry pick and put in there. But what I find going around the country is how many terrific young journalists there are at local papers, and in some communities, and this is one of them, you have a local paper that really is a good newspaper. And then you have places, particularly those that Gannett has gone into, that have just totally stripped the editorial operation, where they have no service except to basically make some money. But there are. And then you look at something like the Miami Herald, which was once one of the great newspapers, and now look at it.
Sure.
So, but yes.
But you can say that about large papers too. The LA Times is not what the LA Times was.
3.25 or 3.5 when you made your list.
Right.
When you said the LA Times, every day coming down.
Mm-hmm.
What would recommend to young people considering going into journalism? Would you give them an inspirational talk? Bob?
No, I'm reminded when you asked that of, it was 2 years ago when Mark Felt came forward and identified himself as Deep Throat. They had a film festival in New York City where they showed All the President's Men. And I hadn't seen it, the movie version, for 25 years. And I took my young daughter, who was 9 at the time, and she sat next to me and squirming the whole time. And it was over, and I said, so what did you think? What's your review? Now, she's raised in Washington, so she's kind of a policy wonk, or at least she thinks that way. And so she went, A, the guy playing you doesn't look at all like you. B, boring, boring, boring. You know, now that's, you know, there's something going on there. She knows how to slice Dad up. But it was boring. And the message I came away from that...
No, not at
well,
all.
no. There's a tedium to it. There's a tedium.
Tedium to the process.
Yes,
and it shows
exactly.
That's what the movie's about.
Yeah, but they don't, but they show, yes, but the movie is truncated version. They don't show for 10 minutes or 3 hours you and I going knocking on doors. And
I want to see what happens when Diana reads the book.
yeah, no, but the idea is that you get more no's than yeses in that kind of reporting. And it showed basically the yeses. It hinted at the no's. Yeah, it showed
It's
it.
one of the best scenes in the movie. In fact, is it holds the middle of it, and I saw
Yes.
that night, is we knock on the doors and the doors slam.
Right,
I'm
and
not
it
sure.
went on for about 2 minutes in the movie, and in our lives,
Right.
it went on for 3 months. And I think that's what she was saying, that she got, that it was boring. Now, what I took away from that movie, seeing it again, is that it's all night work. That movie takes place at night. And I'll tell you, it sent me, on my last book, out into the night, more and more and more. People are home. They're not running off to the next appointment. No one knows you're there. You can get 4 or 5 hours sometimes with people. And so I don't work days anymore. I work nights.
And he goes to bed at 10 at night. It's true.
Bob, we have about, 5 minutes left. I'd like to close by talking a bit about Watergate and Deep Throat, because that was certainly the focus of so much of this. The final question I'll ask you, is there anything that we don't know about Watergate? Is any further digging necessary? But I guess the larger question I'd like to ask you as well is, when you had Mark Felt as your source, he was one person. And then he was a very different person with dementia later in life. And the question then became, essentially, what do you owe that source who was very, very different as an individual when you promised him full confidentiality, but 30 years later is a different person who is being pressed by others basically to come out, and you know his memory is very, very foggy, and even if he does come out, It may have been under some form of coercion. He may not have been in full control of his faculties. In other words, how do you handle something like that?
Well, I visited him in 1999 or 2000, and I hadn't seen him for decades or talked to him, and he was on the downhill slope and had clear dementia. And I was worried about that, and I wrote up the whole account of my relationship with him and showed it to my wife and to Ben Bradley, the editor of the Post. And Ben said, you know, this guy is not the same guy. You owe an allegiance to the guy you made the deal with. The last thing you want to do is be seen exploiting him. My wife said, you know, maybe you should just let the mystery continue. Carl and I, when Mark Felt came out on his own, we were horrified.
Well, we spent the first part of the day trying to figure out, like in the old days, how to keep the Washington Post from doing what it wanted to do and do what we wanted them to do, which is to say, to keep this, to not confirm it. We tried every way we could to get the Post from confirming it.
And we were trying to figure out how can we issue a non-denial denial.
But then, it's true, but then it turned out that events were moving too fast, that we would have had no credibility, in the paper particularly.
Well, Len Downey, the editor of the paper.
They decided to do it. We were still against it.
Well,
or I was.
But Len said, and he was right, he looked at us and said, it's over.
Yeah.
And he was wiser than we were. He realized that it was over. And when we saw Mark Feld on television that night, we realized that it had been a release for him, that he was happy, he had not been exploited, that it was important to be able to tell this story because it was one of the Watergate
I don't agree with
mysteries.
you on that part,
You know,
incidentally. I don't think there's any way of knowing, he might, people with dementia can appear happy, whether he knew he was exploited or not, I don't agree with that. I think, though, that we had no choice at that point because he was obviously compass enough at certain points to have told people, and those people were out there saying it, and they were his family and his lawyer, and he was out there confirming it.
And there was a wonderful thing about it. It was true.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So is Len Downey correct? The book has been closed on Watergate?
No. We had an interview that I did a couple of months ago, just January of 2007, with the assistant postmaster general in the Nixon administration, who said 6 months before Watergate, he was asked by one of the top people in the Nixon White House if they could open Larry O'Brien's mail, Larry O'Brien being the head of the Democratic National Committee. It's possible, and there's been a lot written about this, that one of the big motives for going into Watergate was finding out what Larry O'Brien knew about Howard Hughes. And the Watergate burglars were caught with this sophisticated photographic equipment, photographing files and letters from Larry O'Brien.
But with great regularity, the Nixon tapes appear with more and more revelations, both into Nixon's psyche and how Watergate was the obvious and logical outgrowth of his psyche, and that's not going to stop. We're constantly surprised, including things about Kissinger, and that Kissinger has tried to push aside that now about his own closeness to some of these events.
So it'll never be over.
So we'll see you back in 2008. Thank you very much.